So I hope you're liking all of your talks so far. This wow, speaking well today. This talk is called the tablecloth trick, also known as updating a legacy system with minimal user process disruption, which I'll explain in a second. I'm Laurie, like she just said. And I'll tell you a little bit about myself. So I'm a software engineer with 10 Mile Square Technologies. Full disclosure, until Andy's talk, this said full stack software developer. So we're all learning things today. I don't like counting either. In a previous life, I was a civilian for the Department of Defense, and I was a program manager in my role there. So for about 2.5 years, I worked on 2 really large enterprise legacy modernization efforts, one of which you'll hear about today. And since that time, I've worked for a couple smaller private consulting companies. I've worked on a bunch of modernization efforts. So randomly, I ended up knowing a lot about this stuff, because it seems to be the only thing I ever do. And the last thing, in case you're curious, just to kind of get the perspective and the angle that I take on these things, my background is in mathematics and computer science with a dash of political science thrown in just for good measure, thus why I live in DC. So what are we talking about today? Everyone knows what system modernization is. Obviously, we've heard a lot of speakers talk about it today, but just to give the quick overview, we all have reasons for wanting to improve a system, whether we make it better, faster, stronger, prettier. There's lots of reasons to do so. Well, a lot of us are developers in this room, as we learned earlier. And sometimes building something that we've already built isn't nearly as fun as building something new. So we'll procrastinate, and we won't upgrade a system until we absolutely have to, because it's super brittle, or the software we're using isn't being patched anymore, or my personal favorite, the Dilbert example up there, which is the people who built it and maintained it haven't worked for the company for 10 years, and no one has any idea how anything works. And so they just decide to build it from scratch all over again. So you're technically strapped, and you have to upgrade your system. People do it all the time. Well, sometimes your users don't really want a new system. In fact, they're super non-technical, and it's taken them forever to figure out how to use it. If you work in the federal space, you see this all the time. And their process is painstakingly documented, so you're going to have a hard time getting any changes past them. So what do if you have to upgrade it for technical reasons, but your users don't want you to at all? I can tell you it's really hard to do this well, and because of that, I'm going to tell you a bunch of really great horror stories about all the things that I've done that you really, really shouldn't do. So we'll start with a How I Met Your Mother story. So one of the first systems I ever worked on was when I was at the Department of Defense, and we were taking 10 different systems that did different things, were created and maintained by different teams, and had different political structures that were in charge of them, and making them into one monolithic giant system. Why in the world would we do something this crazy? Congress. That's always the reason, right? In this case, Congress decided that the agency needed an agency-wide auditing system. So we had to figure out how all of these 10 systems worked, what they did, and how to put them into one big piece. So full disclosure on this, I started on this project about a year into it. So they'd already gotten all of the requirements gathered, and when I started, they were just starting to present the screenshots of what the product did, screen by screen by screen by screen, really efficient. So you can see where this is going. So I came in, and they were gathering the requirements, and this was my first time seeing this system. I quickly realized it was the user's first time seeing the system. They had given these requirements a full year earlier. The developers had gone off into a corner and built what they thought the team said that they needed and wanted, and come back and said, here's your system. It has to go live by congressional decree in about 4 weeks. So that was going to go really well. I sat in 8 to 9 hour long meetings every single day for weeks on end with each of these 10 groups, walking through the screenshots of their system. They weren't touching the system, they were just looking at the system. And they were freaking out. because there were all kinds of screens that they could critique. There were all kinds of screens that they said, we told you we needed this, where is this? And they made a giant list for the developers of all the changes that they needed to be done for the system to even work properly. Well, they had 4 weeks. This list would have taken them a year, and I'm not exaggerating. So they put as many fixes of the critical fixes that they could into the system, and it went live. Anyone want to see where this goes? So the system was live, but nobody knew how to use it. The accounting system that had this really painstakingly documented process, no one could figure out which text boxes were for which monetary value. They couldn't bypass screens that didn't apply to the particular scenario that they were working on, and in some cases they couldn't find the functionality at all. Everyone looked like Mr. Bean, and it wasn't good. My favorite anecdote from this particular point during the project was the warehouse team. They were part of this auditing system because of supply chain. So all of these boxes were coming through the door, but they weren't leaving the warehouse because they couldn't track them, so they ran out of room. They just had too many boxes, and the UPS truck couldn't show up anymore. So what did they do? They asked for help. With a lot of reluctance, the product managers and some of the developers went to sit in the spaces with the users to keep the government function from completely falling apart, and I'm sure there's a joke in there somewhere. But that wasn't enough. The tech team realized very quickly that there were things in the system that needed to be there and were not there. So I sat on an hour-long call every day, at the end of the day, going through the most critical fixes that had been brought up that day and prioritizing them. In fact, the heads of each of the organizations of these 10 different parts of the agency would barter with each other to figure out whose piece was going to get fixed first. So obviously, this is a situation you never want to be in. So what did I learn? Just want to make sure you're still here. The first thing I learned, learn your edge cases. Part of the reason the system was such a mess was that the users were seeing it for the first time, and the developers hadn't reached out to them in the year since they'd gathered those initial requirements. And a lot of things happened in that year. The process changed, whether because law demanded that it did or just because. Developers or people who use the system would leave, and no one was talking about how that changed things. And one other really big thing happened. The users forgot or remembered what they forgot to tell the developers. They forgot to tell them this edge case or that edge case. And that happened dozens, I'd guess hundreds of times, but the users weren't part of the conversation anymore, and that was a problem. Learning your product as well as your users know it is really critical. You'll learn their trust, but you'll also trust yourself to build it if the users aren't in the room with you. Agile and incremental requirements are your friend as much as you can enforce them in the federal space. Your users should QA. The horror story I just told you is that the users didn't know how to use the system once it was put in front of them. And yes, I know training is a thing, but having them part of their QA process means that they're more likely to find something that doesn't make sense within their process sooner rather than later. And they'll feel comfortable knowing how to use the system from early on, and you can tweak things. And then you won't see Mr. Bean going up there being like, I'm super confused. This last one seems really obvious. Post-deployment support, everyone knows what that is. But I put it in for a couple reasons. So you would be surprised how many people think that if you build a system for an internal customer to your company, you don't need to support them once you give it to them. Almost every single modernization project I've worked on, the customer end user is within your own company. It still matters, I promise. They won't be able to use it whether they work for someone else or they work for you. But the second reason I put this in here is because I think it's a really good barometer for how well you've done your job. If you've built the system basically the same way it was before and the users have been involved throughout the process, you gain a ton of time because you've built this into your schedule and you don't need it anymore. Or you only need a little bit of it. So this was a bad situation. On the next project, we wanted to do better. Makes sense. So this next project is an enterprise tool Your relatives probably know about. Your grandparents might even use it, and it has wide adoption. So if it has such wide adoption and everyone uses it and likes it, why would you replace it? So the back-end data structures were so bad that nobody could add, delete, or change any information for fear of the whole thing crashing down. It was a giant Jenga game, and no one was going to be able to move. It was in total stalemate. So they had to change a lot of things to upgrade the system. They had to change a data collection tool, a data storage system that was versioned, an internal portal, and a little algorithm tool that worked with some various calculations. They had to do all of those things, but it was an internal tool, so you'll see later when I talk about deadlines. Given that, we tried to do a lot of things differently from the last project. So the users were involved in every meeting. They were in sprint planning, and they were in stand-ups, and they were in reviews. They were everywhere. Every single ticket that went through Jira had a UAT component, and they signed off and knew what it was doing and why. And when we delivered the system to them, there was lots of post-deployment support, but for the most part, we didn't need it. It took about 2 weeks to fix any bugs that we deemed worth fixing. Otherwise, it was just, maybe that would be nice to have in the future. So everything was great. Nothing went wrong. We learned all our lessons. No, that didn't happen. So what went wrong this time? Well, Mr. Bean's still here, but for a totally different reason. The users weren't confused by the system. The users were confused by us, the technical team. Because when you have them in every meeting, they get really freaked out if you start talking about implementation details in front of them and they don't have a clue what you're talking about. In fact, we had conversations related to back-end data storage, and they would chime in with some random edge case that they thought applied because they were really confused. You want them in those meetings. It's preferable in basically every scenario, but try and keep it to the what, not the how. I'll talk to that in a little bit. The other thing that happened was, I'll do this because I like it. Everybody wanted to be the boss. There was kind of this political power struggle that we started to see, and it was on both sides. The users wanted to take control of their domain. In this case, they were the stewards of the data in the system. They just were non-technical. They were mathematical. And so anytime we talked about changes in the system or tweaks that would needed to be made, and we said, you'll have to talk to the tech team about that, they said, we don't like that. We don't want to be beholden to the tech team. Well, the tech team didn't like going the long way around to do stuff for the users, because why should we make our jobs harder just to make the users happier? So we had this kind of back and forth going on. Then we have our last fun little scenario. The other thing that happened here was the sheer scale of the project. Having the users do QA and making sure we built each piece the right way the first time was super beneficial, but it took a bit longer. So the problem was we were replacing 5 different parts of the system with a completely new architecture, and only a couple of those pieces were made to be backwards compatible with the legacy system. So it was all or nothing for the rest of the system. Well, that was all well and good. It's an internal system, it's in use, we can keep using the legacy system. Well, not so much. In this case, there was an internal project that the system was supposed to be used for, and the legacy system was primed for each of these projects throughout the years, 2 months in advance. We didn't do that because, well, the new system's coming online and this will make sure it gets done. Yeah, don't do that. You can't deploy half a project. So what did we learn this time? Don't bog down your non-technical users. It seems like an obvious solution, but it's kind of a fine line. You want your users involved in conversations, and you want them to hear enough of the functional implementation back and forth so they can stop you when something doesn't jive with what they know. But too many technical implementation talks, and they won't trust you to be away from them for more than 5 seconds. So keep your deep dive conversations in separate meetings. You can have design and architecture meetings and all of that. And when you're with them, keep it more to the what and not the how. But I do recommend you keep them in as many meetings as you can. The standard for improvements. That power struggle I talked about, part of that is remembering who your user is. They get to make the final call in a lot of cases because they didn't want this system replaced in the first place. So if you have to go the long way around within reason, it's normally preferable. And the other side of the coin is if you have come up with something that you think will change their lives and make it super easy, that's not your call. Run it by them first. They get to make that choice because I've seen lots of snappy UI decisions and then the users see it and they're like, I don't know what this does or what this means. Where did my old, black and white DOS screen go? And don't bite off more than you can chew. So there's always a deadline. You literally cannot avoid them. And if you're upgrading a larger system, do it piecemeal, make it backwards compatible. It's preferable in almost every scenario. And it doesn't do you any good to follow everything I've said for the last 17, 18 minutes or so and not have a working system when you need one. It literally defeats the purpose. Your users still need to get your jobs done. This is a working system. It's not like you can delay this fancy new feature. So I know I've thrown a lot at you, but I hope at least some of the horror stories I've given you will make them kind of stick in your brain. But if there's 3 things I want you to remember, because you have that whole, only give them 3 things to remember, it would be these. So remember that legacy system replacements are about your users. They decide whether or not you were successful. Know how your system works, but also understand what it does and how your user interacts with it. That will help you immensely. And keep your users involved. It's in their best interest to get this system working the same way that they can interact with it and get it done on time. And in addition to those lovely 3 things I've just told you and everything I've talked about, remember that you still have a technical project to build and you have to worry about all that other stuff you always have to worry about. So it's just been made even harder. So I hope you enjoyed this talk, and if you have any questions, I'll be around. Thank you.